Hi, this is Flynn Busey along with Lamore Shafman. Welcome to the TechCast webinar series entitled Foresight in Turbulent Times, Tools for Managing Change and Risk. I think we all recognize that these are turbulent times, and it's during these times that foresight tools and capabilities to gather broad perspectives help us be more agile and adjust to the change and deal with the risk. There are a lot of people providing tools to support that, and one of those is our guest tonight, SciCast, which is a project that has used some of the most advanced techniques to forecast and assess various kinds of future information. It's a particular program. I'm going to turn it over to Lamore.
And so it's our pleasure to have you and have our speakers here with us today. We're going to be looking at SciCast and its foresight methodology, cybersecurity markets, and the near and far future of AI, artificial intelligence. With us is Charles Twardy. Dr. Twardy leads the SciCast Science and Technology Forecasting Project at George Mason University. Also Dan Geer, the Chief Information Security Officer for In-Q-Tel, which is a nonprofit investment firm that invests in technologies for the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies. And Robin Hanson, he's an Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University and a Research Associate at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Charles, why don't we start with you? Why don't you give us a sense of, let's take a deep dive into SciCast and into the world of SciCast and how you do what you do over there.
Thank you very much, Lamore. I'm excited and really honored to be here for this webinar. SciCast and TechCast both share a vision that forecasting should be accountable. That is, you should be making specific forecasts and keeping track of which ones you get right and which ones you get wrong. And that enables you to do many powerful things, but fundamentally it enables you to see how well you're doing and improve over time. SciCast uses a prediction market, which is a different approach from TechCast, even though we have the same goal. And since some people are not familiar with prediction markets, I want to take just 10 minutes at the beginning to introduce the whole audience to prediction markets and to SciCast's market in particular, before going into a deep dive on cybersecurity, where Dan Geer will talk about the importance of forecasting in cybersecurity, and then we'll move on to the future of AI with Robin Hanson. If I could have the next slide, please. For the past 4 years, this is a very exciting slide. For the past 4 years, we've been funded by IARPA to develop a new kind of prediction market and test it, and for 2 years that's been on science and technology forecasting. We're very grateful for their funding, and I do just want to say that my opinions here are my own and not theirs. Next slide. The fundamental difference between a prediction market and a survey is that market participants have finite resources. In our case, when you sign up to SciCast, we give you 5,000 points, and every time you change the market's estimate, you have to invest those points. If you've moved it in what turns out to be the right direction, and we'll know that when the question resolves, then you will get extra points and over time get more influence. And if you've moved it in the wrong direction, you lose your investment. So over time, the market allocates resources to the people who are good at answering the kinds of questions we're asking. That means that if you're a forecaster, you might want to skip questions where you don't think you know more than the average forecaster. But managing points is difficult for beginners. So by default, we start them at this interface, which looks like a survey. In this case, I have picked a particular question: Will any government officially accept a digital currency by the deadline? In our prediction market, all questions have to have a deadline, a use-by date, so that we can evaluate them yes or no. It's told me the market thinks this is somewhere in the 40 to 60% range, and I think it should be more likely than that. So I've selected likely, 60 to 80%. This also may be new to people who aren't used to our forecasting, we're always asking our participants to give us a probability or an estimate of the chances. And then we score over time by how close the forecast was to putting 100% probability on the actual outcome. I would then submit my forecast, and the system would decide, based on how certain I was and what it knew about me, especially my past performance, how big of a trade to make in the market behind the scenes. Next slide. The market then puts my forecast together with everyone else's to give a familiar stock ticker line of the market's forecast over time. And it has done generally very well. Here's two examples of questions where it did well and what it looks like. We asked for the Axion dark matter experiment, would it have a positive result by the middle of last year? Forecasters were always suspicious of this. They were skeptical, that is. The forecast never moved above 50%. Maybe these will be detected, but not by that time. It moved around in the 30 to 50% range, and then about 2 months before the deadline, the market decided, no, this just isn't going to happen. We're not seeing all the preliminary results or information that we would need to see in order for this to be positive by July. And that turned out to be correct. Similarly, we asked whether Amazon would adopt Bitcoin by a certain time. The market immediately said, this is unlikely, but not impossible, somewhere in the 10% range. But if you look at the trace on the right, you can see the market reacting to news over time. Something would make Bitcoin more prominent, and this was a time period when it was very much in the news. The probability would go up, but there'd be no further movement, and it would settle back to baseline. So these are what successful forecasts look like. The market fairly quickly decides it takes a strong position and holds it. Next. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one. A little bit of extra information that quantitative forecasting methods have been found to be better than qualitative forecasting methods, particularly for science and technology. And there was a very nice analysis done by the Twardy group a couple of years ago. Prediction markets have been compared to surveys in many fields, from presidential elections to horse races, and found to be as good or better. And they have a special advantage when your information cycle is much faster than your formal survey cycle. Prediction markets can react very quickly. And that's a substantial advantage if you're trying to get the best time averaged forecast. And I think that's all we need for this slide right now. Anyone wanting to go deeper can ask questions on Twitter or on the GoToMeeting app. Once our forecasters get familiar with survey mode, most of them switch over to what we call power mode. They've learned about points and how to manage them and how to avoid the common mistakes of putting too many eggs in one basket. And they choose the power mode interface. Here we have a question on the amount of digital information being produced. It's a multiple choice question. So I've selected one particular answer bucket. Said, oh, the probability of that one is currently 25%. I'm going to move it. And you can see the word debit, 0 points, under the middle. This interface lets me move the market to wherever I want to, but the farther I move it, the more it's going to cost me. So I have to be very, very sure in order to move it a large distance. And that kind of immediate tie to finite resources often helps people be better calibrated. I can be more confident in my forecasts when I don't have anything at stake. But often when you put money or even virtual points at stake, people say, well, you know, now that you say that, I can imagine several ways where this could go wrong. All right, next. IARPA did not fund us to create just another prediction market. Most of what I've said before applies to any prediction market. Finite resources, resources moving to the people who are doing better over time, and those incentives to speak loudly when you know something and hold back when you don't apply anywhere. But our prediction market in SciCast lets forecasters relate questions to each other. This is new, it's different, and it's powerful. And Dan in particular is going to talk about how it might be useful in cybersecurity forecasting. SciCast forecasters can take one question and say, you know what, this depends on the outcome to another question. They can make that link and then estimate the conditional probability or the correlation between these two questions. So for example, that Bitcoin question, you might think Amazon's unlikely to adopt Bitcoin, but if Google adopted Bitcoin, you might think Amazon would be very likely indeed to do so very quickly. As that activity, that linking activity, happens over time, what emerges is something like the causal structure of your domain, which in itself is an interesting artifact separate from the accuracy of the forecast. Next slide. Going to run through very quickly an example of how that works in the cybersecurity domain. We have a question on the number of data breaches in the US, and you could just adjust the forecast. Do I think it's more or less likely that there will be at least 250 data breaches? But if you notice here, it's linked to 4 other questions. 2 of them are about data breaches in a particular sector, finance or health. 2 of them are about cyber attacks on the electric grid. Next slide. When you make that forecast, instead of just adjusting the slider, you can, as I've done here, under the red number 1 bullet, assume the answer to one of those other questions. I have assumed that the finance question is going to turn out to be false. This is a scenario, it's a possible world. In that possible world, the market says the chance of my target question being true is 87%. I can adjust that conditional probability, and it's a conditional bet. If my assumption turns out to be incorrect, the bet is called off, and I neither gain nor lose points. If the assumption is met, then it's a forecast. All right. Underneath, the fundamental advance that has let us relate questions and allow forecasters to relate questions on the fly is the system builds a Bayesian network. And that network does Bayesian inference to keep all of the probabilities coherent in this joint probability structure. So now, the forecast you see on this question reflects changes not only here, but to those 4 linked questions, if the change was big enough. And with the next slide, we can see that indeed some of them are. SciCast lets you see who made what forecast, which is interesting information to explore. In this case, you can see the current forecast is 45%. It was made by Geer, who reduced it from 61%. But that 61% is grayed out because that was not a forecast on this question. It was a forecast by Market Snodsbury on another question, which had the effect of changing this question's probability by 7 percentage points. That sort of conditional capability raises the possibility of saying, what will the outcome be based on our actions? If we were to go into cybersecurity, we might ask, what would our time to detection be based on taking each of several available options? And then perhaps management would choose the one that the market estimates to be the most effective. That's the end of my introduction to SciCast, prediction markets, and this new kind of conditional or combinatorial market. Lamora, are there any questions?
Well, there is one from our audience, and thank you so much for bringing the questions in. The question is this like IARPA's Good Judgment Project?
Yes, it is. We started funded by the same program that was funding the Good Judgment Project, and we were doing geopolitical forecasting for 2 years. They did a phenomenal job. We also beat the baseline thresholds, though not quite as successfully as they did. But we and the sponsor felt that our conditional market, which was brand new technology, might do better in science and technology forecasting than in geopolitics. So we were moved over to geopolitics.
Thank you.
Sorry, moved over to science and technology.
Okay, thanks. And The reason, and so another question that I have as you were speaking, I'm thinking about how this translates and how this is used by corporations and government agencies. So can you, if I'm a business person listening to this, how would I make use of SciCast's format to get questions to particular issues that I'm faced with? What are some ways I should think about this?
I think the most powerful way is like the last example I gave. Because you can relate questions to each other, you can include outcome measures that you care about, whether it's stock price or shipment date or price or product price or quantity or quality, and then relate it to several actions you might take.
Okay.
The market can link those actions.
Please continue. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, the market, which could be people in your company, it could be people external to your company, can then decide which actions are likely to make a difference and make quantitative estimates of how big a difference they think those actions would make. And that can be very powerful information to management.
That's wonderful. So you can use, the people who can respond can be anybody. They don't need to necessarily be forecasters or people who are experts in the field. You can actually bring this to your people within a corporation, and you would get that collective mind understanding, and they'd be able to give you some crowdsourced information.
That's right. It's up to the organizers. SciCast is open to everyone above 18, but Robin in particular has fielded prediction markets inside companies.
Okay. And one last question. How granular can you get, and then how expansive can you get? Are there parameters that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about how we would want to employ the SciCast methodology?
Yes. We pioneered a type of question that lets you forecast a continuous quantity, but you give up a little information on the probability distribution to do that. But if all you care about is the average price or the average quantity, then you can be very fine-grained indeed in our market. Otherwise, you tend to have to put things in bins or buckets, and more than 5 or 10 of those becomes very awkward for your forecasters. The ones who manage it do it by running scripts. This is a good time to contrast with TechCast again. A prediction market really needs to have very clear, definite resolutions. And so it is hard to ask general questions about a long-term adoption rate because the forecasters are looking for a return on their investment. And if they might make 100 points on a question resolving in a month and 100 points on a question resolving in a year, they're going to put most of their resources into answering the near-term question.
Understood. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Charles.
All right. Well, I think this is a good time then to turn it over to Dan Geer, who has thought a lot about cybersecurity. He'll be known to many of the audience, and we're particularly interested in his thoughts about forecasting and cybersecurity.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, Charles. I have spent a good amount of time on the cybersecurity question. I've been at it a long time. Now, I should immediately say that anytime someone says I've been working in cybersecurity for a long time, the first question you should ask them is, well, why haven't you fixed it yet? And I'm certainly vulnerable to that question. I haven't fixed it yet, nor has anyone else. I think part of that is that it is genuinely hard. I might even go so far as to suggest that cybersecurity might be the most difficult intellectual profession on the planet for 2 reasons, which will seem familiar to at least some of you. And one is the rate of change is substantial, and the other is we have sentient opponents. The physicist doesn't, the chemist doesn't, etc. But the cybersecurity person does have sentient opponents, and it is that that combination of a fast rate of change and that we have opponents rather than bad luck that makes this, I think, quite possibly permanently difficult, but certainly difficult at the present time. One aspect of the rapid rates of change is not only technological ferment, but also that the attack surface of the society at large is growing fairly quickly. We're adding points of contact all the time. The Internet of Things, as it's becoming to be called, is certainly growing at a fast clip. If you take Forbes magazine's data on a variety of these parameters and you put them all together, what you get is a 35% compound annual growth rate. It is hard to keep up with a 35% compound annual growth rate that is sustained. And that is just the attack surface. At the same time, it appears to me, anyway, that almost any country that is capable, and a great number of course, private slash amateur slash cybercriminal groups are not in any way focusing on defense, they're focusing on offense. One of the questions that I think would be fascinating for a cyber prediction market to get its hands around was whether or not, and this will not be easy, would be whether or not cybersecurity is permanently offense dominant, or whether we have some hope of reversing the field and eventually becoming defense dominant. I'll leave that for another time, but the fact that our opponents have a durable structural advantage is an important characteristic of this field. Second thing I'd like to say is, under such a circumstance, winning conclusively is not going to happen. Don't expect that this or any other technology will turn out perfection or a genuine secure environment or what have you. Rather, this is a game of shades of gray, and in particular, the question is, how can we best expend our resources? What is the most cost-effective path to doing the best we can do? And for that, we clearly need prediction, because if we don't have prediction, then in a sense, every possible outcome is equally probable, and as such, there's no good mechanism for deciding how to allocate resources. Focusing on what the current situation is, which is what, of course, startups tend to do. Startups tend to say, where is the current pain? Let's solve that problem today. Those don't answer the question, the long-term question. They don't answer the long-term question that we are surrounded with. Perhaps the best example of that question is, how would you know if you were the victim of an so-called advanced persistent threat? How would you know that you were free of that threat? How would you know that you had cleaned? How would you know that they are not that the evidence you found and dealt with was not itself, in some sense, a feint, intended to deceive you? How would you know that? So my point is not to depress anyone, but to say that we're not in the game where permanent victory is likely. As such, allocation of resources based on the best predictions we can get, and furthermore, based on the best predictions we can get as modified by experience, is, I think, unarguably essential to cybersecurity. Now, everybody my age in cybersecurity was trained for something else. I happen to have been trained as a statistician. There are other things you could have been trained for, but of course that makes me interested in measurement. There are no absolutes here. Measurement is a difficult problem. How secure am I? Am I better off than I was this time last year? Am I spending the right amount of money? How do I compare to my peers? What risk transfer options do I have? That's been a set of questions that you could be asked by any responsible CEO type or similar level executive for probably 2 decades. There aren't any such absolutes. On the other hand, people who are on the front line, people who are themselves responsible operationally for cybersecurity for the enterprise in which they're either employed or volunteer or whatever, the people who are directly responsible and have firsthand evidence, they are the best source of information that we can get. As a side issue, and there's one slide there, I believe, for this, I run, along with a colleague, Mukul Parikh, I run an index of cybersecurity. In that we are trying to get a good take on what is our current position and velocity, if you want to call it that. If you want to take, sort of use a physical analog, what is our current position and philosophy of velocity in cybersecurity? That's modeled on the Consumer Confidence Index. That's a topic for another day. But that is one way to approach this. The other way to approach it is, I believe, through a prediction market. Because on the one hand, it is exceptionally useful to know where am I and how fast am I going and in what direction. And the other is to say, where do I think I will end up in a period of time with respect to a given question that has a closing date that is advertised within a prediction market. And I'm particularly interested in the conditional market aspect of all of this. One could easily ask, will cyber insurance become not just a nice to have, but a requirement? And one might say, if there is another 200 million individual data theft, will that change? Will that make the probability of some state requiring cyber insurance within the year? You know, what would you say about that? And the conditional aspects of this are, I think, a great deal to do with the impenetrability of the cybersecurity arena, given that we have sentient opponents. And so asking people who are on the front line to make estimates and make both a position and velocity on the one hand, and on the other hand of the future, and in particular contingent future. Once I've learned about all this, I thought, we have to do this. This is the kind of thing where once you know about it, your only reaction can be, we must do this. Now, the paths to predictions, as you well know, are several. But one of the aspects of a prediction market that is especially useful, and I think in cybersecurity, I would underscore the word especially, is the fact that you can call out the poor predictors and retain the good ones. Playing the winner, so to speak, is essential in this because of the amount of background noise. This is an area where signal-to-noise ratio is not inherently good. We need to improve the signal-to-noise ratio, and I think the way to do that is to have a way to invite lots of opinions, lots of, if you want to call it that, bets in a market, and at the same time say, as time goes on, we eliminate those who are not adding value. And that kind of Darwinian approach has to apply to this field. The structural advantage of the opposition does, to a degree, mean that over time we have to imagine that we will come to rely on automation. And automation is already, of course, well underway in many arenas. One could say perhaps that the firewall was the first security automation, perhaps something before that. I'm not into which one came first. What I'm getting at is that automation is essential here, and not just for labor saving and efficiency, but because there are a large number of things where we cannot detect or operate fast enough. As humans, I mean, we cannot detect or operate fast enough given the nature of the threat. So what would we do about that? Well, automation is the obvious answer, but automation is not a non-trivial problem. Automating what people do may or may not be the right idea. Automating what is effective at countering threat requires two things. One, that you have a way to measure whether you have succeeded, and the other is to look over time at the rate of change of what problems you believe you have solved versus what set of problems you believe you have not solved. As a society, we could go either of two directions. One is we could say we're going to take the risk-averse, if you will, direction and not deploy further this, that, or the other until we've have some standards for cybersecurity. There's certainly a good argument to be made for that. I think it will fail because, frankly, by the time we have those standards together, everything will have moved on. Society and technology and so forth will have moved on. It is not possible to keep up the way it is, say, with automobile safety. On the other hand, we could say that we want to have a automation regime where the learning is both from the judgment of people who are front line and from the mechanisms that we deploy in an automated sense. And that leads to the question of, well, are you asking to put intelligence into the cyber protections? And yes, I am asking to put protections into the cyber intelligence. It doesn't exactly thrill me to say that we have to do that, because that has side effects that will have to be dealt with. It doesn't thrill me to say that as a human I am incapable of doing this, that, or the other, including protecting myself or my family or what have you. At the same time, I do want that protection. And if we want cyber security in a world that has a 35% compound annual growth rate of surface area, and where almost every country that is capable is building weapons, as well as, of course, amateurs building weapons, I think that the automation side has got to help us here, because we're not going to be able to do it on our own. And I don't think society is going to say, well, we'll just call a halt until we get this problem solved. That has never happened to my knowledge, and it isn't going to happen here. Yes, we will be affected by public events. The contingent question I gave as an example earlier is of that form. If this happens, will something else happen? Not to get carried away, but where did California SB 1386, the first of the data breach laws, come from? And the answer is it came from a situation in which the California personnel system was broken into, and incidentally, that leaked to the personal information of all members of the sitting California legislature. Well, as you might guess, that was a motivator for change, and there will be other episodes like that. But I would like to have some predictive power around episodes of that sort and others. Do we expect there to be impacts in, say, medical devices anytime soon? Do we think that genomically tailored medicines will be particularly important, not so much for confidentiality, but for integrity? And how would we ask a question about that? Having done having done survey research and prediction markets, I will say this: survey research is vulnerable to idiot respondents. Prediction markets are vulnerable to idiot questions. And whereas I know how to deal with the surveys, I think I'm learning, and my colleagues on this webinar certainly have learned, how to avoid the problem of idiot questions, how to ask questions whose purpose, when answered, actually contributes decision support to this fundamentally difficult problem of cybersecurity protection and the intellectual pressure that is on anybody who is attempting to provide it. So with that, I think I want to turn it over to Robin, who knows more about the how do you craft intelligence aspect of this than anybody else I know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. And actually, before you begin, Robin, if I may, we have just one or two questions here. There's a comment that was brought in. It says, unfortunately, cybersecurity also suffers from the Kriegspiel problem of fog of war, knowledge of capabilities, successes, and failures, and is a tightly guarded and sensitive information. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely true that it suffers from the fog of war problem, and the way you can approach that is through the current debate of should companies or individuals have the right or the permission, or however you want to put it, to strike back. If I'm being bombarded with a, let's say, denial of service from a large number of machines in a particular network or a particular country or what have you, do I have the right to shoot back? My personal predilection is yes, but on the other hand, that is tempered by the very thing that the questioner, the commenter, was getting at, and that is that how do I know that where I would like to shoot back is where I should shoot back? The fog of war aspect here is that almost all denial of service attacks are mounted from machines that are not the property of the attacker but somebody else's, and are, I guess you would call that, unwitting accomplices to the activity. How would you shoot back to that? And I don't know the answer to that. On the other hand, it's clear that under some circumstances, Microsoft working with FBI, for example, that large botnets can be taken down, and that does require some sort of, I guess you can stretch it here a little bit, some sort of shooting back. So there's some level of expertise and cooperation between large enterprises and relevant government agencies that can indeed properly shoot back with a minimization of collateral damage. On the other hand, I probably can't do that. But that exactly illustrates the commenter's point that this does all suffer from fog of war, and that on the one hand would say, well, be careful, prudent, and slow, but careful, prudent, and slow is not what our opponents are good at. They're good at the exact opposite.
Wonderful. Dan, thank you so much. Robin, do you have any thoughts, or why don't you begin with your perspective?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I only have a few minutes here, so I'm going to try to cover a pretty big topic in a short time. So I'm not going to tell you all about the near-term future of AI. I'm going to talk about a particular long-term future, and I'm not going to talk about all possible AI futures. I'm going to talk about a particular sort of AI future. And this is all based on a book that's coming out from Oxford University Press sometime in the next year. Next. Just to review history, in a sense, this is actually a graph. I don't give the numbers here, but on the y-axis is the growth rate of the economy, and the x-axis is time approaching sometime in the near future. What you can see is there was an era of animals growing very slowly, animal brain sizes, long ago, from about 500 billion years. And then over roughly 2 million years, there was an era of humans growing faster as foragers, doubling roughly every 250,000 years, and that lasted for, say, 10,000 years. And then there was an era of farmers. Sorry, the foragers lasted 2 million years. The farmer era lasted roughly 10 or 20,000 years, and they doubled every 1,000 years. And today, the economy's been doubling roughly every 15 years for the last 200 years or so. And the big question is, could something else like that happen next? Could there be another era that would happen next? And if it followed the same pattern as these last ones, it would last maybe a couple years, and then the economy might double every week or month or something, which would be a dramatic growth rate. So, you know, artificial intelligence is one of the kind of scenarios that people pointed to as something that could drive a next big era that would be very different from the current eras. And if it sort of showed up at the same rate as previous era transitions happened, it might happen within a couple of years, transition to an era that grew much faster. The question is, could that be like? So I'm going to do an analysis based on a particular kind of artificial intelligence or robots. I'm not talking about all possibilities, and let me explain what kind I'm talking about in the next slide. So the idea here is called brain emulations. You take a particular human brain, presumably of someone who's smart and capable, and you scan it in great spatial and chemical details to see exactly which cells and which connections are where. Then you have computer models of how each cell type works in terms of taking signals input from other cells and transforming internal state and sending signals out to other cells on the outside. And if you have good enough models and you have a good enough scan and you have enough computers, then you can create a whole model of the entire brain. And if the whole model is good enough, then it should behave like the original. So you connect it up to arms and legs and eyes and ears, and you can talk to it and you can see things. You can ask it to do jobs, and it might do them. And that would be a brain emulation. And if those emulations are cheap enough, with falling computer prices, then they can substitute wholesale for human workers, and they can dramatically change the economy. And so what I'm about to do in the next few minutes is to talk about all the different ways that you could foresee that an economy would change with such emulations in them. I'm using very straightforward standard academic consensus in physics and engineering and psychology and economics. I'm not trying to be creative at all or unusual, except in asking this unusual question: what would the world be like with brain emulations? So a couple of things I can say don't really depend much on them being brain emulations relative to other kinds, so they'll be robot implications in the next slide. So one obvious thing is immortality, which is robots can last forever. Just like cars and houses today can last forever. If you keep repairing a robot, keep copying its brain state into a new backups, etc., then it can just last forever. But of course, like houses and cars, it doesn't have to actually last forever if you don't continue to pay to maintain it. Travel can be cheaper for robots because they can travel electronically. They could copy the state of their brain and transmit it over communication lines across the world, and then download it into a new body and then move around there. We today care about nature, in part because we love nature, but also because we're scared that if we kill nature, we will die, which is a reasonable fear. Robots don't need to be afraid of killing nature. If robots are made in factories and mines, etc., then if they kill nature, they could keep going that way. So they may care less about nature. The last big consequence of robots, which makes many, many implications, is the fact that they're easy to make copies of. So just like you could easily make copies of a digital movie or digital music file, you could make a copy of a file that represented an artificial intelligence of any sort. And that means you can dramatically increase the numbers of them. You can grow the population as fast as you can crank them out of factories. This means wages fall to near subsistence level. This means that growth rates of the economy would dramatically increase and could plausibly increase to the levels talked about before, to doubling every week or month. Robots would quickly grow, very quickly, to become a very strong, large part of the economy, and humans would become eclipsed. Next slide. So humans could still exist, and initially they would own pretty much all of the economy, but slowly they would own a lot smaller fraction of the economy, and very quickly they would be pushed off to the side. They would be sort of rich retiree absentee owners who got lots of money from all the investments and things happening, and they could use that to build vast mansions and yachts or whatever they wanted, but still they wouldn't be with the center of action. The center of action would be where the robots were and all the things they were doing. And the robots would in fact cluster into a few really big dense cities, and humans would be mostly spread out the rest of the Earth away from those cities. Next. Now, because they are emulations of humans, emulations feel like humans, of course, and they look a lot like humans. They are sort of near humans in their capabilities and styles, but they would be selected for being very productive in the emulation world. So the emulation world would be a very competitive world because wages would be near subsistence levels, and it's very easy to make copies. And so there'd be a strong focus on finding the humans who were the most productive as emulations and copying those as opposed to everybody else. So here's in this graph a distribution of humans and emulations in terms of how hardworking or smart they are. And you can see that the blue dots would represent the humans, and the red dots would represent the humans, and blue dots would represent the few emulations who are the few best among all the humans they could find. So, in fact, emulations would be more elite relative to humans than our billionaires or Nobel Prize winners or things like that in our world. Next. Humans would remember having had a human life. Emulations remember having a human life. They would take human style, so they would love, they would argue, they would sing, etc. But they would be selected. So we know some things about how the most productive people in our society are like. So we know they tend to be more smart, conscientious, etc. And we know a bunch of features about how they're different from the average person. So we can predict that emulations would be in these directions as well. So that gives us some way to talk about what the emulation world would be like. We also can predict that these emulations, they would work during the day, and then of course they'd need some break in the evening and sleep, and then they'd get back and they'd work the next day, and all that break would cost in terms of supporting the hardware for the emulation while it was taking leisure and resting. And you could save on that by making many copies of an emulation at the beginning of the workday, having them work through the workday, and then not keeping all those copies at the end of the workday, but only keeping some of them to rest to go to the next day. So those would be what I call spurs. And emulations would tend to be okay with creating a lot of spurs that do a lot of things, because that's just a lot cheaper than having most emulations rest through the evening. There'd be fewer kids with emulations. There might be uneven genders. One gender might be more in demand than another. This competition would select for a very small number of emulations who are the very best, and so there might be only a few hundred humans where copies of them dominate this entire new world, and because of that, they might know each other. They might be Fred and George and Nancy, and it would be more like a forger world that we came from long ago. I think I maybe have roughly used up my 7 or 8 minutes here, so I think this would be a good time to pause and stop and ask for questions.
Oops, sorry. Wonderful, Robin. Thank you so much. And we do have a question for you regarding immortality. How do we know that the brain data structure won't clog, thrash, saturate, etc., when used for longer than what they were evolved for with regard to the EMs?
That's a great question, and in fact, I think they will. That is, so today we see what's called software rot. So even though you can make a copy of a piece of software and you can save it in an archive, and then you can pick it up many years later, and it will be exactly the same as it was before. When you have software that's integrated to an environment, doing tasks and matching other resources, and over time you try to keep adapting the software to match changing environments and changing resources, the software becomes more and more fragile and eventually is no longer very useful compared to starting over fresh with new software. And that's a general phenomena that happens in human brains. That is, young humans are flexible in their minds, and with time they become more fragile. They have initially fluid intelligence, which becomes crystallized intelligence later. And we see a similar phenomena in products and biology, and it seems like this. There's just a general tendency for a system that continually adapts to new circumstances to become fragile over time, and so emulations would have a limited work life, productive work life, which might be a century, perhaps, or more, but after that period, they would no longer be competitive with younger emulations, and they would need to retire. But as retirees, fragility isn't a problem. They could just be fragile retirees who are not very adaptable, and they could have an indefinite life as a retiree, as long as they could afford the resources to continue in retirement.
So, Robin, one other question that comes to mind is, and actually multiple questions are coming to mind. And I invite everyone, we're now going to open this up, so please write in your questions for Charles, Dan, and for Robin, and I'll bring them in to the rest of the session. So, Robin, I'm interested in this, just even the format of these EMs, and are they going to be then designed, are we going to keep them in human form as you have depicted here, or are we going to design them to be more efficient? Are they going to be designed for the purpose in which they're specifically addressing? What do you see happening with that?
So today most jobs are office jobs, desk jobs, at least in an advanced economy like ours, and I would predict that would continue. And so for office jobs, your body doesn't really matter that much except that it be convenient and comfortable for you. So I expect that basically for most emulations at work would be in office jobs, and they would be in a virtual reality office with a virtual reality desk, and so their body would be comfortable and familiar. When they're leisuring, of course, almost all of them would be in a virtual reality enjoying a leisure there. So I think their body, in fact, would be whatever is comfortable and familiar to have as a desk job or in leisure. Now, some of the emulations would have physical jobs, certainly maybe 20%, where they actually need to be interacting with physical objects in the world. And for that, they would have whatever body best matched that task. So today, if you drive a bulldozer, that's the right body basically to dig big piles of dirt. And people operating a bulldozer operated as if it was their body. Basically, that's how their mental attitude toward the bulldozer becomes. And for emulations, their bulldozer would just be their body. And so you would have a wide range of bodies adapted to particular tasks for people who need bodies to do physical tasks, but for everybody else, it would be virtual reality and comfortable, familiar, probably beautiful bodies.
Wonderful. Okay, understood. We have another question from the audience. How far away is general AI?
Far. Well, of course, now emulations are a form of general AI, and I didn't talk about when this might happen, but I'd say roughly sometime in the next century. But if you have in mind the other standard way of making general AI, i.e. writing software, creating software modules in the usual way we make software to make AI, I basically think that process has been going very slow. So I'm in the habit of asking people who are AI researchers about their specific subfield, and I ask them, how far have we come in your subfield in the last 20 years relative to the human level abilities in your subfield? And people typically say we've come 5 to 10% of the way in the last 20 years toward human level abilities. So projecting that out, you're talking 2 to 4 centuries, which is a long way away. So if emulations really do come within a century, then we will still be a long way away from general AI software when emulations show up, which means there's plenty of jobs for them to do.
Interesting. And we have another question. What would replace knowledge work that is automated?
There are just a vast range of things to do in an economy, and as we get richer, we find more things to do. That is, there are things that just weren't doing before that we figure out, well, it's finally cheap enough that we can do them, so we do them. So whatever jobs we automate, then of course all the jobs that aren't automated remain, and so far that has been a vast number of jobs. Of course, eventually, if machines are just better than humans at everything, then humans will have to retire and live off of their investments in machines. Emulations have a longer life of beating automated software or software that's been handwritten to do things, but eventually they also may be beaten entirely everywhere at the competitive process of being more productive by these other machines, and then they'll have to retire.
Understood. I'm wondering about the other side of the equation, and then I have a question for both Charles and for Dan. Singularity. I'm just really curious with regard to singularity. How is singularity and that shift of humanity? How does it interrelate with what you're talking with regard to AI?
Well, singularity is a word that has a lot of different connotations. One connotation of singularity is whenever we have human-level machines, that's a singularity, and obviously that I've been talking about one and several scenarios of that here in the entire talk. Mm-hmm. Another scenario concept of singularity is a point in time in the future when things change very fast and it's hard to foresee. And I have been talking about a point in time in the future when things will all of a sudden start changing very fast. That is that sudden jump in growth rates that I talked about in an early slide. But I disagree that you can't foresee past that point. The whole point of my analysis is to say, yes, you can foresee. You just apply standard tools, turn the crank, and we can foresee many implications of these changes.
Okay, thank you, Robin. We have a question here which may be appropriate for both Charles and Dan. It's one advantage of prediction markets is that they can reveal a security vulnerability without specifying how the vulnerability works. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I'll jump in there. I'm a trust but verify sort of guy, so somebody telling me there's a hole in some program somewhere, but they're not going to tell me how it works or where it is, I'm not particularly interested in that. At the same time, I'm not particularly interested in somebody saying, we won't tell you how our software works, just trust us. As a rule, I'm not fond of that either. That puts me a bit at odds with the public in general, which is I don't want to know how it works, just leave me alone, and I'll enjoy my whatever it is. Or as Robin was saying, my retirement while the machines do everything. I am on record in a different setting that vulnerabilities, when discovered, ought to be brought into the open. And so if a prediction market is a vehicle for saying there's a vulnerability in X, and the organized body of process that a prediction market represents confirms that this is likely, even if you don't know where it is, if it confirms it's likely, well, that's worth acting on. And if your only measure is something worth acting on, then that might well be quite useful. In fact, I suspect it would be quite useful. But to have a prediction market say, the truth is that there's such and such a thing, but we will never see it. Like there really is a unicorn, but we'll never see one. I find that less useful.
Okay.
This is Charles. For one scenario that we envisioned was after a public breach like Heartbleed. Say, oh, there was this vulnerability that people didn't realize. Well, given that that was there, what else do we think is likely to be affected? Or given that we found a vulnerability in Bash, where should we be looking? And a market could use people's expert knowledge of what things are likely to reuse Bash code or to reuse the same libraries that Bash used and say, we should be looking at these kinds of routers, we should be looking at these batches of software. Before...
Yeah, I'll buy that, Charles. You know, that I'll buy completely. The sort of reasoning by analogy here, I think, is quite relevant.
Okay. We have another question here, which we have another maybe 2 minutes in our time here together. Rather than gain knowledge from human experts, why not use the wisdom, quote unquote, wisdom of the crowds, and why not learn directly by showing images and cancer outcomes so they can learn and create new neural knowledge networks? Charles, you want to address that?
I'm trying to wrap my head around the question.
I think they're suggesting machine learning or statistics as a way to learn things. And we are using machine learning and statistics as much as we can. It's just hard to do very much of it. We're not very good at it. So when we're better, we can do more with it.
Okay. So the program that funded us originally, geopolitical forecasting, they did also look at machine learning, but it was recognized that in geopolitics, most of what you want to forecast is unique or rare events, where you needed an answer before you could even figure out how to gather the appropriate data set. So there's a role for expert judgment. The second is people have started doing a lot of research on hybrid forecasting, machines plus humans. And these systems tend to outperform either alone. The canonical situation is sports forecasting, where the machines do much better most of the time because they're not partial to their favorite team and they're good at tracking the base rate. But humans win when there's something unusual, like a key player has a broken leg. And so together the combined system turns out to outperform either alone.
Which does go directly back to this idea that there are situations in which only frontline security people can make a good judgment, and there are obviously situations where the law of large numbers is on your side, and I think for cybersecurity, sometimes the law of large numbers is on your side, but by and large, for targeted attacks, for example, that's not the case.
Okay. And Robin, for yourself, a final word with regard to this?
What I said was just a very small fraction of all the things I can say. So I have longer talks online. There's a TEDx talk and hour-long talks and the whole book, of course, coming out. So